So long story short, not only are there happen to be 4 billion different things that you could find on the internet as far as the definition of a leader, here are some of the quotes that I chose to go ahead and bring and talk with you tonight. So we can see that there's a lot of definitions. You could in fact create your own. You could do a combination of things, whatever. Now, I want to go ahead and talk about the phrase leadership styles. I'm sure when it comes to being an effective leader, you hear that thrown out a lot, right? What's your leadership style? Have you ever had that perhaps in an interview question? Is that something you've asked others? Is that something that you've been asked yourself? So next I want to go ahead and introduce you to the concept of the 4 pillars of leadership. So with this, I was very intentional about putting the very first one there at the bottom as leaders are clear thinkers. I mentioned to you just a few moments ago at the beginning, thinking is going to be a theme that we will be touching on throughout the presentation tonight, because that's so important when you think about it for leadership. That's a big difference. Then leaders lead themselves. That makes sense, right? Leaders lead others. This is the one that happens to be written about the most when it comes to leadership books. So that's one I think everybody's familiar with. The other 3 concepts may be a little bit differently. And then leaders are authentic. Now it's important to have this up there at the top as well, because even though you've got the handout, it talks about 6 different styles here, what's important is that you're authentic with your own style. And it doesn't need to be something that's a cookie cutter ready made. If someone asks you, what's your leadership style? You don't need to necessarily reference and say, oh, I am visionary, you know, and try to memorize those bullets. You want to be able to describe what that is for yourself. It doesn't have to fit into one of those boxes. It's good for you to be familiar with it. So if they happen to be quoting it, then that way at least you've got some reference point. Make sense? Okay. Now, the thing about this, as I mentioned earlier as well, it's not really 4 things we're looking at, because there's extensions to each one of them. As a matter of fact, they're comprised of 25 skills total. And obviously they're not split evenly, because you've got 4 and 25, that math doesn't add up. But let's talk about how these break down a little bit overall. Okay, so let's talk about that foundational one that I mentioned as well, that's so key. And it has to do with leaders are clear thinkers. Now, what do you think about when you hear that phrase, leaders are clear thinkers? Is that necessary for someone to be an effective leader? And why?
They're decisive.
Being decisive, okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, what else? Yeah?
I think how can you set a strategy that others will follow if you have a hard time understanding?
Exactly, that's right. So if you're going to be visionary as a leader and you've got followers, they need to know that you're a clear thinker, that you understand what it is that you're trying to get them to do. If you're influencing, right? If you're trying to empower them. So as I mentioned, it breaks it down into different skills. This one happens to break it down into 7. So I'll read these to you in case anybody has any trouble seeing these. Not in any particular order, but it's being futuristic thinking, conceptual thinking, planning and organizing, creativity. That happened to be one of my favorite courses, by the way, in my psychology degree program. So there's a lot of great things. I love the workshop on that. Continuous learning, that is key. The problem solving, decision making, I think this happens to be what a lot of people think about when it comes to being an effective leader. So those are just some things overall when it comes to being clear thinkers. So this comprises 5 different skills, okay? Self-management, personal accountability, flexibility, resilience, and goal achievement. Leaders lead others. So, as I mentioned, you can see this is a really big circle there because you've got 12 different ones that come around that. So let me take a look and read to you what those are. Empathy. Is that necessary for an effective leader? Yeah, it is. Understanding and evaluating others. Presentation skills. Don't forget to study TED Talks, I'm just saying. Written communication. Diplomacy and tact. How important is that to be an effective leader? Things can really go sideways if you don't have diplomacy and tact. And I have to tell you a funny story as well about this written communication. There was a CEO that is being coached right now on his written communication because his company, all of the employees get so confused on some of the messaging that he sends out. And I will say that he even sent something to myself and a few other colleagues last week, and 5 of us interpreted his email in 5 totally different ways. And then we were like, how ironic is it that he's actually working on written communication? Maybe he needs to have some extra sessions. So, just based on the fact that we all interpreted it differently. Therefore, you can see why that's such an important skill, because if people have your message open to interpretation, guess what? How can they achieve what you're hoping they will achieve? They just won't. So you've got to make that clear. Maybe part of that goes back to having clear thinking, because maybe he or she's not clear on their thinking either. So I'm just saying, there's some connections. Interpersonal skills, persuasion and negotiation. This will be good when you come up with those other modules in the next few sessions that you've got. Conflict management. So I want to touch on that and some of the causes that can also lead into that, just like I mentioned a moment ago about doing the coaching between those 2 individuals. Teamwork. And so when you think about effective leaders and then teamwork, what comes to mind? Do they need to be team-oriented? Because if they're a leader, they could call the shots theoretically, right? Thoughts? What do you think about the connection between leaders leading others and teamwork?
You need to understand how a team works.
Yes. That's exactly right. And a lot of this has to do with culture. Because when you want to have an effective work environment, you have to be intentional thinking about the culture. And that is something that just doesn't happen with the snap of a finger. Organizations are very intentional, especially when they're starting out. And if they're not, Lord help them, they need to be. Because otherwise it's going to turn into something that they just didn't realize, and then you have to really take some time to step back and readjust when it comes to culture. So that's really important. And so that's why teamwork is so important. And not only that, I mean, let's just face it, even with leaders, they've still got their own teammates as well in a lot of situations. And what was the 4th pillar? Yes, leaders are authentic. So going back a moment ago, we started talking about the 6 different leadership styles, according to Daniel Goleman. Once again, there's different ones out there. But as I mentioned, this is about you finding your own style, you being authentic. And quite honestly, I think this goes back to the advice that Brené Brown had in her TED Talk when it comes to being vulnerable, because that's going to be so important when it comes to being authentic. And one of the things that I want to point out here is that for you to be able to find your authentic style, you need to be open to feedback. You need to be able to acknowledge the gap between who you want to be and who you are. Does that make sense? Does anybody here happen to do vision boards? Are you familiar with vision boards? Okay, so you're familiar and you're just like, no, I'm not doing them. I see how this group is. Well, let's just say if you had a vision board, that's really the concept behind it, right? Is that you go ahead and you're intentionally thinking about who you want to be. Maybe it's in that year, maybe it's overall in your career, and then what you're doing is you're visualizing it. Well, not you, because you're not doing it. But, but you get the idea that if you wound up doing something like that, it's you being very intentional. And so I do encourage you to put some thought into it, put some reflection, regardless if you put it on the board or not, but to be thinking about who it is that you want to be. Who do you want to show up? How do you want others to know you and talk about you? So if they say your name, who do you want to be remembered as? And then think about how you are right now. How does that compare with who you want to be? That's the gap. And then that's how you want to focus on closing that gap overall. That to me is really going to tap into your authenticity. And that's going to take courage. It's also going to take some self-awareness, which I think is also how these reports happen to be good, because it helps you to have a mirror. And also the thing is too, let's face it, none of us want to be put into a box. And that could have been one of the first things that you were thinking as you read the report, like, I am not going to be just a type. I'm my own person. But really, it's just to help you think about the mirror and how is it that you're perceiving yourself versus how others could be perceiving you. So that's going to lead me to the next concept here, which is going to be that awareness gap. Before I click on that, do you realize that there are 2 experts in every conversation? Who are the experts and what are you the expert of? What's that?
Each individual talking is.
To a degree, yes.
What was that you said?
That each person talking thinks that they're the ones that know best. Did I say it
The
right?
person talking is the expert in their opinion.
Yes. Or their intent. So what you think about with that is that, for example, I am the expert of my intention. That's it. That's the only expertise I have right now. There's a lot of you that have expertise right now on my impact. I can't be an expert on my impact. I don't know what that is. You can tell me. You can tell me later. You can email me, hey, listen, this could have been a little bit better if you'd have gotten answering quicker to the point. So that's what's really important, is thinking about that. So with that in mind, when you think about the intention and the impact, this is really where I think that you can have some potential challenge or reasons for conflict, is because we judge ourselves by our intentions. But guess how we're judging others? On their impact. Think about that for a minute. Is that true? I think we're all kind of guilty of that, right? Think about how different it would be if we started judging others by what we think their intention is. You think that would make a difference? And if so, how?
It would solicit more empathy.
Yeah, it would, right?
But what if they're not meeting their goals or something, and you're just, busy being empathetic, but, your company's in the toilet?
Well, part of that could be understanding their intention of, it's not their intention that they wind up, doing a poor job. They have a good intention, but perhaps then they need to have their potential unlocked. And it's understanding about what motivates them. And once again, that can start going into the report, because you've got 4 different sciences that go into it. So you've got not just the behaviors, but the driving forces. So if we start thinking about motivating someone, a lot of times I think people are only, from a company perspective, thinking that their employees are motivated by money, when really that's not the case for the vast majority. It's about their desire to go to work. It's their desire to do a good job. So I think you as a leader, it's the opportunity then to turn around and help them get there. Does that make sense? What else? What else do you think about if you were to judge others by their intention? How would that change situations? Yeah. So not to be as reactive in the response. So I think part of that, one thing that I deal with a lot with people that I coach is they start telling me how emotional they get about certain situations. Something that's just driving them crazy. It could be a situation, it could be another individual. So I talk with them a lot of times about practicing meta-awareness. Has anybody heard of that? We talk a lot about it in my psychology courses. And basically what that is, and I think this really speaks to this aspect of intention and impact, it's stepping back to pause. So you think about what your own reaction is. What's the emotion? You're actually thinking about it. You're labeling it, and then you're setting it aside so it's not controlling you in that moment. Because think about it, when your emotions are taking over, you can't always think clearly about the situations, because that's all you can think about is how it's impacting you. If you're only thinking about how it's impacting you, then how can you think about the other person's intention? It's clouding that. So that's why you have to pause for a little bit. Look at the emotion, acknowledge it, set it aside, visually put it like in a box and put it somewhere. Put it in a balloon that it's going to float away for a little bit. So then that way you can start thinking about the situation from the other person's point of view. And you also have to be thinking about what is it that you're projecting into that situation. Is it that someone else did something similar, and so now you're just making that assumption that everyone is acting like that, and so that person's getting the brunt of it? You know, is it other issues that maybe were small that's still feeding into that, and that's your part that you're starting to bring into that situation and project? Once again, it goes back to the QBQ, that situation about the accountability. And then when you start to think about with that person, start thinking about their intention, it's allowing you to see things perhaps a little bit more clearly, or at least from their perspective. So then that way you can think a bit more clearly, going back to the first pillar, and then be able to deal with it. Hopefully a little bit more objectively, so the emotions aren't getting the best. Now let's go back to one of the last things that's on the 5-finger agenda, which was going to be leadership versus management. And do you think that being a leader is something that you can grow? Get your skills? Okay. Good, because you can. I just wanted to make sure. Let's get all grounded on that. That's absolutely right. So part of this is thinking that with management, it does tend to be more linear. You really think about that more in terms of process. There's a process to management. So some of this is just a way to think about this, but it really can be linear. And it's structure, it's process. That's one of the main things. Versus leadership. So if you don't need leadership if you know the answer. So it's really more about management having a destination to go towards. Leadership, that's more the journey. It's more about the exploration for that. And that's why I put this quote up here that you can't read because I keep standing in front of you. But it's leadership is about committing to exploration. Because if you look over there with the different bubbles, you've got a lot of different variables. So if you think about leadership, it's about considering how it's not just going to be this one little cookie cutter box, right? That's why I couldn't come here with leadership in a box kind of a situation for you, because there's variables that go into that. And what did I say it was about? Thinking. So it's not looking for a destination. It's looking for exploring alternative ways of seeing or experiencing something. So when it comes to resources, here are some that I recommend, and you're obviously going to have this with the PDF that's going to get sent out. So one is Brené Brown. The reason I go ahead and put this up front is because I do feel that as leaders continue to progress in their career, they start having some self-doubt. They start thinking that they do need to have the answers to everything, and they start thinking eventually, am I going to be found out? You know, am I good enough for this role? And so part of what she's addressing there is that vulnerability and the importance of that. The Effective Executive, I think, is really good, and I'm actually going to send a link that it's not even just to the book, but it's like a 7-minute video that drills down some of the main skills that he's talking about. And Peter Drucker, as you recall in the beginning, was the one that was the founder basically of executive management and some different things with that, and MBA programs, and just a huge thought leader. In addition, finish watching the video that we'd started, which was with Edward de Bono, and also the 6 Thinking Hats. So I'll send you that link so you can start practicing some of those things. Daniel Goleman with the emotional intelligence, because I think as a leader, that's so key, is to understand that. I couldn't help it. So obviously looking at that from a different lens, because I'm a huge proponent of not only considering leadership books, but looking for it in different ways. You can find leadership and good leaders, and bless you, in a lot of different ways. And so I do feel that it's just an interesting approach to look at someone like that and start identifying how back in the day when there was segregation that was taking place here in the US, and there was even a thing like late 60s, early 70s, especially in the South, where they didn't even want whites and African Americans to like be in the same pool. You know, at that time, I thought he was such a true leader because I couldn't believe that he actually addressed that on the children's show. And so he made it a point to talk about those kinds of things. When Robert Kennedy was assassinated, he actually addressed assassination on his show to help kids understand that a little bit more. So it's amazing some of the things that he came out with that. And then obviously with QBQ, because I think with leadership, what's so important is as you continue to rise and progress in your career, it really is still continuing to think about the accountability component, because that to me is so important. You have to make sure that you have that. All right, now as far as some other resources, because we were talking about those 4 pillars. So this is a website. As I mentioned to you, the program overall is the Complete Leader. And with the Complete Leader, what I like with this is it actually breaks it down into those pillars. And I'll even give you an idea of what this looks like. When you click on the link, once you sign up for this, you can actually have access to where you click on it and it says, okay, if you want to get into futuristic thinking, it breaks it down and it tells you what pillar that's a part of. And then you've got access to, example, podcast, videos, blogs, just a lot of different aspects like that.